Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, dear journalists. It is Finance Today, and we're here with a panel from WWF. We'd like to speak to you about biodiversity finance, a very important area. And I would just like quickly to introduce the panel that we've got here. On my left, we've got Florian Titze, who is our international biodiversity policy advisor from WWF Germany. And on his right, we've got Ms. Tanya Steele, CEO of WWF UK, and Margaret Kulo. And I'm Innocent Maloba from a senior specialist in multilateral affairs at WWF International. So we have been gathered here in Montreal. Every one of us is looking for an ambitious framework, one that will hold and reverse the loss of biodiversity, lead us to a world where we have more biodiversity than we had in 2020. We expect this to be adopted here in Montreal before Christmas. However, looking at the pace of the negotiations, it is quite worrying, particularly with regards to the discussions on the means of implementation, the resource mobilization. We all know that the means of implementation are quite important in putting the framework into practice, but the process has been worryingly slow. Now, make no mistake, all parties need to ramp up their ambition. All parties need to ramp up their ambition. This ambition must be reflected across all the elements of the global the global framework. Developing countries have a responsibility to protect the biodiversity, but this also means that developed country parties must be in a position to step up the ambition that is expressed in other elements of the framework. This ambition must be reflected in such a way that it is evident of their commitment to support the developing countries to protect the biodiversity that we all need, that is important for our economies. However, as that we speak now, I think the whole discussions is on a brink of this is on the brink of a precipice. Total breakdown is imminent, and as we as we would like to proceed with the high-level segment, I think this is the right time that action is taken. We actually need this action to be done in making sure that we've got an ambitious framework, and in particular, getting the means of implementation. And I would like to clarify that it's not only about the amount, it's not only about the numbers, but we must also get the means of getting this finance where it is needed most, in the most efficient and effective way. So I'll hand over the floor to my colleagues. I'll start with Florian, who will talk a little bit about the current state of affairs in the biodiversity finance negotiations. Thanks. Over to you, Florian.
Thank you, Innocent. Yes, I'm going to talk a bit about the state of the negotiations on finance and resource mobilization. And there, what we are seeing, what really worries us is that currently there's simply a lack of political will compared to what's needed to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. And the breakdown of the negotiations that Innocent is talking about that seems to be imminent is really a result of that. I want to clarify, nothing is lost yet. We still look hopeful towards the next week when ministers are here and hopefully can come together and rally. But the ministers really need to show up, and they really must step up and show us that they're willing to not only ask for ambitious targets, but also take action on them. And that includes paying the bill. At the start, I'd like to highlight a few things that we think that are needed for a comprehensive financing package. And that can be summarized as greening finance and financing green. In essence, meaning more financial resources must be mobilized to support the implementation of the framework. And on the other hand, we need to minimize those investments that harm nature. And in addition, one thing that is to highlight is that a lot of these resources will have to be available fast. We need them immediately because we need to start implementing the outcome of this COP, the post-2020 framework, immediately and with the beginning of next year, because we don't have time. And we also need to leverage all sources of finance, and that includes domestic, private, international, and public financing. And the multilateral development banks, financial institutions must also do their part and contribute. Sort of that's a summary of some of the points that we need to be reflected in this framework and where parties need to agree on. Now let me go to where we are in the negotiations, and that's two topics I want to touch on. One is the target on harmful subsidies that was negotiated and discussed yesterday. And there I'm coming back to the lack of political will that I already addressed. Because what we're currently seeing, and which is very worrying to us, is that the path that the negotiations are on currently may lead us to a level of ambition that is lower than that target that we've already agreed on 12 years ago in the previous framework. It's not there yet, but that's the path that we're on. And think about what that means for a moment. While for the past decade, biodiversity loss has been increasing, has been accelerating, 1 million species at risk of extinction, leaders here may decide that they agree on a target where we're doing less now than that we've already agreed on 12 years ago. That is not the political signal that we need to go to the world to save this planet. And then on the financing negotiations, I first want to highlight that we do need a comprehensive package that includes involvement of the finance sector, private finance, domestic finance, and Margaret will speak to that and Tanya as well. But what we cannot forget is that for the immediate implementation of this framework, the support of the Global South, the developing countries that will carry a lot of the burden because a lot of the biodiversity left on this planet is in their territories, they need the support, and that needs to come through international financing. And there we currently also see a lack of ambition. We have seen contributions in the recent past, but it's simply not yet enough. And the developed countries need to show more flexibility, more political will in discussing what can be the outcome here and ultimately agree what the outcome that is needed for this framework. And that essentially where I want to end with is that, as Innocent has said, this doesn't speak to the amounts, the numbers, how much do we need, but also on the conditions, on how those financial resources are mobilized, how they get to where they are needed most fast and effectively, so it actually contributes quickly to the implementation on the ground starting from next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florian. Margaret?
Great. Thank you very much. I have the distinct pleasure, I would say, of having just come from moderating a panel for the opening of Finance Day. Today is Finance Day at the COP with voices from the finance sector, public and private. And there were surprisingly unified messages, very strong voices around a number of key messages. I want to get to that in just a second. I want to talk about first, before the key messages, the really qualitative and in some ways quantitative difference that we've seen in engagement of the finance sector, both public and private, around issues related to nature loss, biodiversity loss, because they recognize that without nature we can't solve climate, either from a mitigation point of view or from a resilience point of view, and that there are key linkages between nature and our economy and people at the end of the day. Many of them are facing pressure from their own employees. They're facing pressure from clients. They're facing pressure from regulators. And there's really a qualitative change in the conversation around engagement. I think one great example of that is the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, with which hopefully you're all familiar with right now. They have now 126 private financial institutions who have signed on to that pledge. They have together almost 19 trillion euros in assets under management. So this is a lot of potential money movement, really calling for engagement of companies, engagement with each other, collaboration around data and metrics in particular. Calling to assess impacts, and also calling to report publicly on those impacts. So to the messaging that I heard very clearly in the conversation this morning, the sector wants a clear framework, the same kind of clear framework that the Paris Agreement has provided in its targets, in the amount of countries that have come together to agree, and in the language around alignment in particular. That's the second point. So the first point is that clear framework. The second point is around alignment. Many of the financial institutions face challenges in their own engagement, especially the private regulated financial institutions, because they're basically pushing a ball uphill against the perverse economic incentives that continue to provide fuel for money to flow in the wrong direction. So there's a real attention on that alignment discussion, both for those who are able to provide innovative tools to really get more money to the ground, to intact nature where we need it, and also to reduce harmful subsidies, reduce the perverse incentives that keep money flowing in the wrong direction. And then last, there's a very clear call for disclosure of information. Financial institutions have a hard time understanding what risks they're exposed to if their clients aren't disclosing their impacts and dependencies on nature. So they need, in order to for themselves report, and also to be able to understand their own risks within their portfolio. They also sent the clear message, we need that mandatory disclosure, we need it now. It gets better quality data, it gets more data to enable this sort of better decision making, and they're not going to wait, they're all moving. So the overarching message on the whole discussion was the time to act really is now. It's amazing to have that message come from financial institutions. I had the privilege of moderating, but this wasn't WWF content. It wasn't an environmental organization or scientists. It was financial institutions, a central bank, a pension fund, an impact investor, a multilateral, all saying we need a clear agreement, we need alignment, we need disclosure.
Thank you very much. An ounce of optimism, given the current circumstances. Tanya, are there any lessons from the climate financing? Thank you.
I think they are, and I think I'll be echoing many of the comments also made by Margaret. I think what we've heard already this morning is that much global finance is bankrolling the destruction of nature, and this can and should be reversed. Today, Finance Day must be a watershed moment when we finally recognise the importance of nature in our long-term prosperity and indeed in planetary survival. We've all heard the phrase, nature and climate are two sides of the same coin, which is true, but when you flip the coin, the odds are weighted against nature. The science is clear, it's unequivocal. Nature loss drives over a fifth of global climate emissions, and our land and our oceans absorb over half of all human man-made emissions. So the nature and climate crises drive each other, and as a result, they must be tackled together. So this is why WWF UK are launching a new report with Aviva that finds that the investment needed to protect and restore nature lags far behind action to attract climate finance. Since the Paris Agreement in 2015, the rapid growth in efforts to align financial institutions with net zero shows that the right policies, consisting of binding global targets and national goals, measurable targets and global national scenarios, play a critical role in private climate financing. Published today, the Unlocking Finance for Nature report outlines a pathway to mobilise private finance for nature, drawing on the lessons learned from climate action. Climate finance can be unlocked to protect and restore nature, but the private sector can't do this alone. Currently, there are limited policies to incentivise finance to support the sustainable use of nature. Agreed frameworks at COP15 could play a significant role in positively directing financial flows to protect and to restore nature. And importantly, a 360-degree government approach is needed, where policy, regulation, public spending create the right incentives and approach climate and nature together. That starts, of course, with clear targets and economic policies that give clarity to the finance sector. If I was to give an example, the food systems are to nature what fossil fuels have been to climate. Yet with the right incentives and frameworks in place, we could potentially unlock and redirect trillions of dollars to support rather than undermine our global nature goals through financing nature's destruction. So we're calling on policymakers to bring forward policies that are critical to unlock private finance and incorporate the learnings from climate financing by setting measurable global and national targets for nature and how to realistically achieve and pay for them. Today, we know that governments and the private sector are already engaged in unlocking climate action and financing. However, we also know that there is a blank space when it comes to financing nature. Yet we know, of course, the science dictates that climate and nature loss must be tackled together. And there is an opportunity, a very real opportunity, to slipstream nature into this existing work. Transition plans are a prime example, and where businesses will benefit from considering the two together. So, to summarise, the difference in progress between climate versus nature financing is not justified by the science, nor does it lead to efficient solutions. Until now, nature's green currency has been simply overlooked and undervalued. Yet there is a growing scientific consensus that limiting global warming to ensure a habitable climate and protecting biodiversity are mutually supporting goals. So in other words, nature loss poses as large an economic and societal risk as climate change and must, of course, be addressed very much with the same urgency. Back to you, Innocent.
Thank you very much, Tonya, for that very crisp and clear finish. We have some time for questions, so we'll take two at a time. I'll take one from this end, and if there is no from this end, so I'll take one you first, and then you go next. Thanks. Please, yeah, sure, please.
Hi there, I'm Kate Allen from the Toronto Star. We're heading into the high-level ministerial discussion, so I'm curious about the role of leadership in what you're all talking about. We've heard about a leadership vacuum. There's also sort of this tension between, the presidency versus the host country, and I'm curious how you think that has played into the situation that we find ourselves in that you've just described.
Thank you. So, please. Pass the mic. There you go.
Thank you. This is Jida from Kyodo News. I have two questions. As for the TNFD disclosure, are you satisfied with the current text that including with mandatory requirements or something? My second question is that for the subsidies, you find some backlash from each target, right? Could you please explain more about what backlash you found in the current text compared to the each target?
Thank you. Florian, you could start with the second question first.
Yes, thank you. Currently, negotiations on Target 18 on harmful subsidies, we are getting very close to basically a very similar target than we had 12 years ago. what's critical there is that the elimination of harmful subsidies, that's a strong wording that basically plays to the ambition that we don't want to have any harmful subsidies to nature, to biodiversity loss, because that adds pressure, and it's been reflected in, I think, the words here on the stage. Currently, we see that wording on the elimination pressured. There seems to be a lack of ambition on actually admitting that we really need to address them. It also plays to the level of urgency that is required, because these are policy reforms that also take time. They're politically difficult, so we really must tackle them now and not get away from that level of urgency and ambition.
So my colleague would like to respond to the question on financial disclosures, but it was not very clear. So if you could kindly just quickly repeat the question. Thank you.
So yeah, out for the TNFD disclosure, I found some text that including with mandatory requirements or something, right? Are you satisfied with that kind of expression?
The Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures is, TNFD is currently in the process of developing their framework. It's already being tested and piloted both by corporates and by financial institutions. And they are clearly, all of the members are also clearly signaling for mandatory disclosure. And I think with respect to how that language is reflected, the mandatory language is reflected in the latest state of the agreement. I would turn that component of the question to Florian.
Well, undecided as we speak, so also not secure yet, I would say.
Thank you. So for your first question, Quate, the thing is that we expect leadership from all parties, because as we speak right now, the destruction of nature is ongoing. And what we needed is the global framework today. We need it before Christmas. And given that we have almost reached to a point where the piece that will tie it together is facing hurdles, basically we need leadership from everywhere, from the presidency, but most importantly from all parties. And at the current moment, we expect quite a lot of flexibility from the developing countries, because from the developed countries on the issue of biodiversity finance. Because we've seen quite lots of discussions and some progress in the ambition, but we need to tie all these up together, because we need an ambitious framework, but one which is also going to be implemented. And the means of implementation lies at the base of that right now. So we actually need leadership from all. Thank you very much. I'll take two more.
Yeah.
Okay, so you go first. Thanks.
Hi, Orla Dwyer from Carbon Brief. My question is for Florian, but I'd be interested in hearing from the other panelists as well. You mentioned on Target 18 the potential for backtracking on the Aichi targets. How do you think countries were able to agree those targets 12 years ago at a time when, it was still difficult to agree on wording around that, but the potential for that looks less likely here? Is it because the implementation measures are going to be stronger around these targets, or why do you think it's been very difficult for countries to agree on issues like this that they had previously agreed to 12 years ago?
Yep.
Canadians RBC is the 5th largest investor in fossil fuels globally. Is it weird that financial institutes are investing in biodiversity which is damaged by oil and gas developments they support?
Thank you very much. I think I will start with the last question. And Tanya, would you like to respond to this? Thank you.
Yeah, I will. Thank you for the question. And I think that's a great question. I think what actually this starts with is probably a number of things. First of all, what leaders we hope, and particularly that will be arriving very soon from around the world, is to ensure that we get the right ambition for reaching the right biodiversity targets moving forward. That has to be in place. And then what we need next is the frameworks and the ways in which businesses and organisations can start to play their part in implementing those targets. We know for some businesses that's going to take time, and we talk about transition to enable that time. But by being clear about what they're required to do, by them stating their goals, by having science-based targets, we are hopeful that we can hold them to account to make that transition so that we do see nature restoring and not being destroyed at the current rate as well.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Unfortunately, I've been given the red flag to stop because we're out of time. But all the panelists are available at the back of the green room and will be much willing to respond to all the questions, including the one that we were not able to respond. So please feel free to come to the back. Thank you. Thank you very much.